because I think it's important for people to realize, this is what's different is that, and I'm glad you mentioned this, is that, now you have a multiracial, multicultural Democratic coalition where there is still tension. And the tension that exists is because of this legacy where a lot of the white folks were like, racial progress and equity, we'll just punt it for another decade. We'll keep punting it.
I actually think at this moment in time, and as part of the tragedy of the failure of collective memory, I think at this moment in time, there were within the Democratic Party enough white ethnics who were close enough to their own immigration experience, who were close enough, particularly if they were Catholic, to feel like they had been othered, to be a little more receptive. They weren't exactly forward-looking, but they also understood the electoral math. Some of Humphrey's unexpected support at the 1948 convention when he's pushing this, very positive civil rights plank of the sort that Democrats had never accepted before, he's getting support from some of these big city Democratic bosses who are not exactly your classic liberals. But they can actually see that if the Democratic Party doesn't become more inclusive, then it's going to lose elections. That they're not only will Harry Truman lose at the top of the ticket, but they'll lose these down ballot races as well. I think another difference is that there were not a lot, but there were enough people in organized labor, like Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, who understood that organized labor had to start moving in the direction of civil rights. And that moment was there in the 40s, and tragically, it's been lost and forgotten by a fair amount of organized labor and by a great many white ethnics. But it was present then. And Wajahat, the last thing I want to say is the effect of World War II, that this country had just finished fighting a global war against fascism, against forms of racial supremacy and religious supremacy. And a lot of blood and treasure had been spent on that. And there were a lot of Black GIs and also Jewish GIs who came back from the war and said, well, what about the hatred at home now? And that was a pregnant question. And it began to, I think, rouse the conscience of a certain number of white Catholics and Protestants of goodwill. And again, what's really unfortunate is that the memory of that and that alliance hasn't lasted in the same way. But it was front of mind enough then that people could hear Humphrey. Because the incredible thing when he gives the speech at the 1948 convention and says, we've got to walk out of the shadows of states' rights and into the bright sunshine of human rights. And for those who say it's too soon to move on civil rights, I say it's 172 years too late, harking back that to 1776. There are no Black delegates in any numbers to vote for that. There are no Latino delegates. There are probably no Muslim delegates. I
will venture and say no.
There are like 12. There are, I think, 12 Black delegates out of 1,500. So to win that vote, as Humphrey did, he actually had to persuade a huge number of white folks to go with it.
It's basically what he did was, without realizing it, he did the race class narrative that Obama and Democrats since then have tried to emulate, where you can't divorce race from class, and if you combine it in a way which is engaging and honest, you can actually unite workers and people of color with these white workers who historically have been misled, I would say, with the divide and conquer technique by white nationalists, by racists, by nativists.
No, that's totally true. And this is a great achievement. And it's one of the things that ultimately helps Lyndon Johnson, with Humphrey's help, enact the civil rights laws of the mid-1960s, enact the Great Society, social safety net legislation, and certainly gave us the Obama coalition. But we also know that these things don't last. The progress, as I was saying before, brings a backlash. And in a way, in Humphrey's time, he was addressing the backlash that followed Reconstruction. He was addressing the backlash that followed the end of mass immigration in 1924. The next backlash was going to be massive resistance, as they called it in the South, against the civil rights movement and the Brown.
Well, Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, the thing is, the reason why I think it's so important for folks is to connect the dots. Is that what we're witnessing now it has always been part and parcel of the American experiment, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
you see a young, I guess you could call him a progressive, Hubert Humphreys at that time, challenging the establishment. He was a couple years ahead of the curve. You saw white moderates who knew what they had to do, but were terrified,
Hmm.
didn't want to risk any equity. Instead, they found out, oh, this multicultural coalition is what actually helped the Democrats win. That famous photo of Truman holding the newspaper, because Truman was supposed to lose. People forget that, right? They
Right.
already said Dewey was going to win.
Oh, Truman was behind in every poll. And, the Democratic Convention in 48, one part of it was this bitter fight over civil rights. The other part was this totally glum, defeatist mood that, okay, we're going to nominate Harry Truman and he's going to be toast. But this is key, Wajahat. The reason Harry Truman wins, the reason there is that famous photo of him holding the Chicago Tribune headline, Dewey defeats Truman, and laughing at it, is one reason: a surge of black voters. When the Democrats endorsed civil rights in their 48 platform, Truman had no choice but to run on civil rights.
Mm.
2 weeks after the convention, he desegregated the military and he desegregated the federal workforce. And it's not like he did this out of the goodness of his heart. The great black labor leader and civil rights leader, A. Philip Randolph, who had been protesting outside the Democratic Convention Hall in 1948, Randolph was traveling the country mobilizing massive black draft resistance. He was saying black young men should not register and should not serve if called up until Harry Truman desegregates the military. And Truman does that 2 weeks after the convention. The last weekend before Election Day in 1948, he becomes the first major party candidate for president to hold a campaign rally in Harlem, the symbolic capital of Black America. And on Election Day, he wins more black votes than FDR ever did. And he has such a surge in three key swing states that those states, I believe it's Ohio, Illinois, and California, give him together the electoral votes that put him over the top. That's the reason he won: civil rights and the black vote. There is no other reason.
And what's so fascinating is that victory and the desegregation then allows, if you will, the cultural seeds to be planted that eventually lead to Brown versus Board of Education.
Exactly.
In 1953, it gets decided in 54, and we're seeing a replay of the white lash of 54 in 2023 with Moms for Liberty, which recently, as of last week, was referred to. This is a hate group, by the way, folks.
Yeah.
These are the extremist right-wing suburban moms, literally paid by big right-wing money to basically ban books and harass educators. And they were called by ABC News as joyful warriors fighting back.
Yeah, but by the Southern Poverty Law Center, a hate group. And
there you go.
That's the definition I'll take. And watch out, I'm so glad you brought up the fact that they pretend to be this grassroots group, but they get their money funneled through some of Leonard Leo's dark money groups.
Right, Leonard, and we could talk about that. Leonard Leo, who, by the way, just got $1.6 billion last year from Chicago businessman Barry Said. He's the man who is the intermediator, folks, between right-wing money and the Federalist Society, and has helped pack the courts to bring this country back to 1952 or 1953. But speaking about the parallels, here's Hubert Humphrey. He comes out. He makes this race class narrative. Truman hesitantly picks it up. Oh, look, the blacks came out and gave me the victory. Right. Desegregate the military. 1953, Brown versus Board of Education. At that time, there was another Moms for Liberty group that came out, Joyful Warriors, pretty much the exact same narrative, white suburban moms, incensed that a black girl might have the audacity to sit in a classroom and get the same education as her white son and white daughter. And there's a cost. The cost to all this is that the Democrats, for a generation, lose Southern whites.
Well, actually, I mean, what happens is that after what seems to be this breakthrough for the Democrats in 1948, Truman becomes unpopular. The Cold War changes the American narrative to searching for communists under the bed, which really undermines the liberal project. And basically, you have timidity by all the major national politicians. Eisenhower as a Republican, Adlai Stevenson, and then JFK on the Democratic side, they're all timid on civil rights. And Stevenson and JFK even think maybe we can sort of entice the segregationists back in. So the 50s you have tremendous action by the mass movement, by Dr. King and Fred Shuttlesworth and all the other leaders of the freedom movement. John Lewis comes along a little later in the early 60s, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer. So, but there's this period of mass mobilization, and yet at the political level, it's retrenchment and timidity. And that doesn't change. The political response doesn't catch up to the mass movement until Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. Johnson assumes office and decides he's going to make civil rights his linchpin issue. And that's when suddenly the political activity catches back up to the progress, the moral awakening, the kind of righteous discomfort that the movement was causing America.
But I think what's important for people to recognize, especially now, because there's so many problems and there is a retrenchment happening because we have historical amnesia and people unfortunately don't know about the Nazis and what happened in Italy and the rise of fascism. And, even though democracy is deeply troubled, it's the best form of government we have, especially in comparison to authoritarianism. Yes. This retrenchment that can cause so many of us to be apathetic, Sam. I think it's important what you just said is that it took 10 years worth of organization and work at the grassroots to push, to influence, to inspire, and then it caught up to the moment.
Right. You have to have both. I mean, at the 1948 convention, Humphrey is Mr. Inside. He's literally inside the convention hall, giving the speech, working with people in the party to push the civil rights plank in. A. Philip Randolph is literally Mr. Outside. A. Philip Randolph isn't even a Democrat. He's a socialist by ideology and also political party affiliation. He's literally outside the hall leading these protests calling for draft resistance. And after the success of the civil rights plank, there are these letters I've read that go back and forth between Humphrey and some of Randolph's lieutenants, each saying, we couldn't have done it without you. They understood they needed the other. And there's a great book by Nick Cott's wonderful writer who unfortunately died a few years ago called Judgment Days, which is about the parallel experience of LBJ and Martin Luther King in the mid-60s. They each needed each other. Johnson was the ultimate insider, but he needed King to be bringing mass pressure from the outside. And King could bring mass pressure, but you still need someone who can execute the political success on the inside. So there's always been this symbiotic relationship.